Okay, so now that we have a handle on the basics for the various ways that your body has to respond to stimuli, that is the efferent side of a control system, now we're going to start to consider some simple examples. Okay, and reflexes provide the simplest examples because these the decision making that is achieved by the integration centers are not very complex decisions. So again, we just covered the efferent pathways. Let's consider a reflex action that includes or recruits a somatic efferent response. And this is familiar, I think, to everyone who goes to the doctor's office where they test this reflex. It's called the patellar tendon reflex, and you can just kind of feel it as you see this hammer hit just below your patella. And it results in the recruitment of your leg muscles to actually kick your foot outward. And this response is reflexive. And what that means is that there's no intervention required by your brain in order for this to happen. If all of your cells were alive, you could be brain dead and you could still have this response. Okay, so a reflex action is an involuntary and a rapid response to a stimulus. So let's consider what's going on here in a little more detail. So we have the basic parts here. That's your kneecap. And just below your kneecap in black there is a ligament. Okay, so ligaments connect bones to bones. Tendons connect muscles to bone. And the hammer goes there. It hits the patellar ligament. That causes an activation of your quadriceps muscle. Your quadriceps muscle, the muscle on top of your leg, has an antagonistic muscle, the hamstring, on the other side. And so you hit the patellar tendon, it stretches the quadriceps. Like that. There we go. Okay, so where's our control system? Okay, so a lot of these lectures in part 3 are sort of laying out the pieces of a control system. So in this case, the stimulus for our control is that stretch. Okay, you have a rapid stretching of the patellar tendon. The response is the kick. All right, so we get this response on the other end. And so the question here is, what are the parts in between? What are the neurons? Where are the decisions made? Where's the integration center? All that kind of stuff. So where are those parts? Okay, so first of all, the sensory part. Where is the sensing? So you might first think, oh, well, I feel that hammer, hit my skin. Maybe you have sensors in the ligament, something like that. It turns out the sensor is actually in the quadriceps muscle. And in the quadriceps muscle, and this is not a feature shared by all vertebrates, but certainly all mammals have this feature in their skeletal muscles. The muscle is even, I keep saying how smooth muscles are so weird and have a variety of behaviors and everything. Even skeletal muscle is really mysterious in a lot of ways and pretty fascinating. And one thing that's interesting for our current purposes is that skeletal muscles provide sensory information. Just whenever you're walking around or interacting with the world, behaving, then there's a lot of feedback that comes from your skeletal muscles in response to loads on those muscles. And so there's two kinds of receptors in your skeletal muscles. The first here is called a muscle spindle organ, and it detects stretching by the muscle itself. And so that's done via the dendrites of sensory neurons that are wrapped around parts of muscle fibers that don't have the cross striations of the contractile apparatus. All right, so we'll show those schematically right there. That's our muscle spindle organ shown in blue. And so it's sensitive to stretching. So when the patellar tendon, even though that muscle is not activated, when the hammer hits the patellar tendon, it just causes a rapid pulling of the muscle spindle organ because all the muscle fibers in the quadriceps, or a lot of them, are being rapidly pulled. Okay, and that stimulus detected by the muscle spindle, those dendrites of sensory neurons, then extend into the spinal cord. So you got quadriceps, there are neurons that extend up into the spinal cord, and we have, again, this is the afferent side, so the dorsal root ganglion is on the dorsal side. Okay, that's the dorsal fin, dorsal your back. So the cell bodies are in that dorsal root ganglion on the outside, and then those axons terminate in the gray matter. Well, where do they go? Well, the motor neuron for the quadriceps muscle is one recipient of that excitatory signal. And that completes the loop. That's the neuroanatomy that we need for this reflex action. And this is a particular kind of synapse that's known as a monosynaptic reflex. Now, if you want to know if a reflex is mono or polysynaptic, then you count the number of synapses that are arranged in series. That is, you go from the afferent, the afferent side of the sensory organ all the way to the efferent organ, and you count how many synapses connected the two. So even though we've got two synapses in parallel here, that doesn't matter. It's just the ones that are in series, and we've only got one synapse in series, making it a monosynaptic reflex. All right, so here's one of those kinds of clicker questions where I haven't told you the answer. You have to anticipate what the answer is. That is, where is the integration center for a monosynaptic reflex, such as this? Is it A, the synapse, B, the sensor, C, the spike initiating zone of the efferent neuron, or D, the brain? Okay, give me your final answer for this one. Final answer. Okay, you guys did well on this one. I'm proud of you because so 60% of you got it right, which is better than how people usually do on that question. So this is kind of a nice example. So when we were talking about neurons and dendrites versus axons and what a neuron does, we were talking about some of these concepts very abstractly. And one thing that's kind of fun about part 3 of this course is that you can start to see these principles in action. And so here would be an example of how temporal summation can be useful. So the muscle spindle organ sends its sensory information as a train of action potentials. And if it's more stretched, then it sends a more frequent excitatory signal to the motor neuron. Well, if you ramp up the frequency, then that's going to allow for temporal summation, which makes it more and more likely that this motor neuron is going to be activated. So that's an example of where the reflex action, the efferent side of things, is activated as a consequence of a more rapid signal, a higher frequency signal. And it also illustrates, because it's a reflex, how you have decision made by just one cell. That is, the spike initiating zone of the motor neuron decides whether or not that quadriceps muscle is going to contract. And so you can make the decision making very explicit by an algorithm. for that region of that cell, which is just quite simply that if the spike initiating zone is above threshold because of those voltage-gated sodium channels that are there, then you're going to get an excitatory signal. You're going to have the motor neuron generate action potentials to activate the quadriceps muscle. So if we jump back to the left, we're laying out this control system. We've got the afferent side, the muscle spindle organ. That's sending a signal onto the motor neuron, which is functioning as our integration center. And that's going to, in turn, activate the efferent organ, the quadriceps muscle. At the same time, and you might think, well, this is all well and good for the doctor's office, but like, who cares? Well, this is a diagnostic for how your musculoskeletal system is functioning in a reflexive way. And again, as you're walking around or interacting with the world in a physical way, your body is constantly making adjustments to the activation of muscles according to mechanical feedback. So this is all going on whenever you're moving around. Question?
Is it possible for the muscle spindle to send an inhibitory signal instead of an excitatory signal?
That's a perfect question. In fact, yes. So whenever we have these reflex actions, we don't want descending commands from, say, our motor cortex in our brain to trump the activations of these reflex actions. You know, so if you sort of twist your ankle or a little bit or something like that, you want to have a very rapid corrective action, all via a suite of muscles, and that's all done reflexively. If your muscles were instead still responding to the walking commands, then you wouldn't be able to execute the reflexive action. And so this inhibitory signal allows for a trumping of the descending commands that might be happening or other commands that might be trying to control these actions. Instead, it's essentially saying to the hamstring muscle, no, the hamstring muscle right now cannot be activated. And so we have this inhibitory neuron that is going to hyperpolarize the membranes of those muscle fibers, making it so the motor neurons that feed the hamstring cannot activate that muscle. Okay, it's essentially taking the hamstring out of commission so that when the quadriceps gets activated, it actually causes your leg to kick. And so as a consequence of these two actions, you get a kicking. Now, the inhibition isn't necessary unless there's some other command. Okay, so this is, you might say, you know, why don't we just remove this? Well, again, if there's other competing signals going to the hamstring, then this reflex action is going to shut out those other signals. And this provides us with an example not of a negative feedback situation. This isn't really a regulatory function, but instead it's a sequence of actions that are triggered by a threshold stimulus. So we call this, again, a feed-forward control system. The efferent response, that is the kicking, does not vary with the afferent input. It's not modulating the response, okay? You don't have a feedback loop. Instead, the stimulus just causes the action to play out in a similar way every time. Now, this doesn't mean, because it's feed-forward and reflexive, it doesn't mean that you can't feel it. After all, skeletal muscles are getting activated, and you can feel the hammer hit your knee, but that's through ascending signals to the brain, again, that's through white matter, that make your brain aware of what's going on, even though the brain doesn't have to intervene or make any decisions. Okay, your spinal cord alone is making the decisions via these monosynaptic reflexes. And so it's those commands ascend into the brain, in particular the thalamus, again, this sort of this relay station in the brain, and then there's a region of the brain within the cerebrum that can detect what's going on in your body. Your touch senses are all decoded up there. And so you can feel the stimulus because the signal is transmitted up there in those higher centers of the brain, the somatic sensory cortex. So let's just leave it at that, and I'll see you on Wednesday.